the main approach of the Good Life movement is that we are doing political awareness and organizing for mental health. And so what that means is, we're trying to get the people more involved in the politics of mental health specifically. And the way we're doing that is we're coming out with like a bigger vision of how we can solve the problems and a clear plan on how we can fix the crisis, the care crisis. The HQ of our team is going to create scorecards and hold every single politician accountable and say,
Wow.
hey, like, here's the plan. We have like 5 to 10% of the people in your district now. We've created a strong mental health voting block. We've rallied the people. Like, here's a voting card. Here are the policies that me and the rest of the gang of the mental health field have put together. Like, where do you stand on it?
Love it.
92% of Democrats, 92% of independents, and 94% of Republicans all say we need to be doing more on mental health. We have the voters. They're going to hold you accountable. What's the plan? Are you voting yes or no on this bill?
It is my pleasure to welcome to forward the originator of the Math Hat, the number 2 employee in Yang 2020, and now the founder and head of the Good Life movement, brand new, Andrew Frawley. Welcome, Andrew.
Yes. Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Andrew, you and I have known each other for years, ever since you did join our janky little campaign as the second employee. What made you join a campaign that barely existed for president of a guy that no one had heard of?
Yeah, it was definitely a leap of faith. When we first met, I was living in San Francisco, and I was very passionate about mental health and automation. I thought, automation was going to change our society and economy, and that was going to have very negative effects on mental health. And super randomly, I was visiting New York City and met you, and you were talking about mental health and automation, and I was like, oh my gosh, like what a match made in heaven. And I thought universal basic income was a super powerful idea for building the security of the people. And obviously that has a huge impact on the mind. So, I was 23. I didn't really have many other options in my career.
You're not supposed to say that.
I was looking around and I said, well, this is a big idea, a smart guy. It's a moonshot, but let's go for it.
Well, you were integral early on. Remember, you and I were scrapping and hustling, driving around some rental car. I remember you being one of my early hype men or hype people, where you introduced me at a co-working space in San Francisco.
I went all in.
Yes, and then we were on a tour together, and I remember showing up to that venue, and there were these math signs that you had originated. You were the first merchandise head of Yang 2020. I didn't think anything of it, honestly. I was like, oh, math, that's cool. And then people started picking them up and waving them, and it became this massive thing. What inspired you to try and even invest, frankly, hard-earned campaign money in a math sign?
Well, I guess the idea around math really is that it was a symbol of thinking for the campaign. Like, it was a huge focus on, the numbers and really improving lives, and not really getting caught up in what so often feels like a circus in politics. It was an absolute focus, razor focus on, the mechanisms that are going to improve the lives of people. And people agreed with that. They kind of seemed to resonate.
Yeah, well, it certainly took off, man. I think we sold several $1 million worth of math hats alone, much less overall merch. So thank you.
Hundreds of thousands of them. It was quite the treat.
No, and thank you to everyone who contributed to the campaign, raised tens of millions, and went on to compete on 7 debate stages, thanks to folks around the country. But really, thanks to folks like you who bought in early and formed the core of our little team that grew. What a journey we had, my friend. What was your craziest memory from the trail, aside from any of the stuff I just said, since none of that stuff's that crazy?
Without a doubt, it was, I forget what they changed the name of it, but I think it was the Johnson & Johnson dinner in Iowa, which is when all of the candidates came together for this sort of final Super Bowl moment in Iowa. And you had, I was with you backstage, and I was doing photography at the time, and, we came across paths with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and Michael Bennett. And, it's one of those moments where you're sort of looking around and you're like, how am I here? Like, how did we get here? Especially given the humble beginnings. Like, we had started an apartment with this pipe dream of like basically free money to the people, and yet here we were, with a good message that threaded the needle perfectly, and we were, hanging out with, now the
I
president of the United
think it was
States.
called the Liberty and Justice
Yeah, they
Dinner.
changed the name, and so
Yeah, the
I
Liberty
always
and
get
Justice
confused what it
Dinner
was.
in Des Moines, Iowa. I remember that night well. My wife Evelyn was there, so that was glorious fun. And that was relatively late in the campaign. That was, wow, maybe January, because Iowa voted in February. And then after the campaign ended, you went to work on the Bloomberg campaign briefly, but simultaneously, you were already originating what now has become the Good Life movement.
Yeah, I mean, the good life movement is something that has basically been percolating in my mind since 2016. Like when I was working with, thinking about your campaign, I was already thinking about the systems of how do we improve mental health. But the journey goes back all the way to my childhood, where I grew up in Northern Virginia, which is a sort of wholesome American suburb, I guess. And my family was sort of a product of the American dream a bit. Like my father's a blue collar, high school educated painter who spent years painting walls until he could work his way up and buy ownership into a small business. My mother was a stay at home mom, PTA, things like that. And our life was like this sort of like commercial sales pitch for like the suburbs. Like we were this family of four, modest suburbs, diverse public schools, like Chili's on Friday and a movie. But the reality is that like this like facade of the dreamy suburbs is so often just that, it's a facade, and under it is so frequently these aching souls. And I've sort of come to see that as a like feature and not a bug of like the American system that seems to just so much profit off of our anxiety. My teens, I had my mental health began to deteriorate very early on. I couldn't keep up with the like meritocracy of the educational system, and then I was diagnosed with ADHD and sort of stigmatized for that and began to crumble a bit. And then unfortunately, my parents divorced, and that just sent me into a total spiral. I spent, roughly 5 or 6 years basically clinically depressed in my mother's basement, angry, playing World of Warcraft for 60 hours a week, making memes and like stabbing, spider crickets that would jump around the basement. And worst of all, I developed an eating disorder. I weighed 300 pounds at the age of 14 and developed a form of OCD called trichotillomania, where you basically just like rip out your hair. And so I was this image of like what today is so commonly the like struggling young men. Like I literally had bald spots in my hair and I weighed 300 pounds. I had two friends. I wanted to vomit when I would go into the lunchroom. And I rebounded a bit, but very unfortunately, I began to medicate in new ways and got caught up in the drug and opiate crisis. And like my friends and I, we would raid. My parents don't even know any of this, but we would raid medicine cabinets at house parties and make bowls of mystery drugs and just take handfuls, basically. And unfortunately, some of my friends continued on that path. Some of them ended up on fentanyl, and some of them passed away. And I still to this day am traumatized by that. And the very sad part about all of that is you tell yourself you're just doing it for the fun and the high at the time, but the reality is sometimes you are. It's not that you want to die, but you're willing to die just to like feel something. And this is unfortunately so common in the country.
Yeah.
Like the seemingly happy suburban home that crumbles is like fundamentally American at this point. And that's it's just the heart of so much of the crisis and what we're doing. And that is what sort of set me on this quest for the good life movement. Is I didn't even realize it. For 15 years I've been trying to basically understand how are we so rich in a country that seemingly has it all so figured out, and yet our people are so sick that like this is what's happening.
Yeah, I love the idea behind the Good Life movement, because when I was running for president, I would say to people all the time, we have record high GDP. And at the time, stock market prices. What else are at record highs? Anxiety, depression, overdoses, suicides, pretty much every sign of people suffering is also skyrocketing. And by the way, this is pre-COVID. Now COVID has been this factor that has reduced life expectancy both directly and indirectly. I said to you before we sat down for the interview, it's like, hey, are we all losing our minds? Because that's the way a lot of people certainly feel. And you were inspired to say, look, there should be a political movement around mental health. And of course, there 100% should be.
Yeah. The radical thing about mental health right now is that it's the cause that pretty much everyone is for. And so just to paint a little bit of the picture of the crisis and the lifestyle and stuff is like, some people are still unsure if we even have a crisis. And the numbers are,
No, because I mean, everyone knows we're
I,
freaking miserable.
we have 1 in 5 Americans this year will have a mental illness. Less than half of them will get treatment. Suicides are up 25% in the last 20 years, while they're going down in other countries. Among youth, it's 84%. Depression is up 1,000% in the last 50 years. And then the thing that nobody's talking about with the crisis is so much of the root of it, right? I have my anecdotes in it, but it sort of bears out in the numbers, which is, when you look at it, you have social media is running around completely unregulated. You have, wealth inequality and all of this. You have climate change. And our political system is also like so, broken and fragmented that it's like eroding the base of like hope and optimism in the country. And this is all while like our lifestyles are falling apart, like our communities, our homes. 40% of Americans say they're lonely. 49% of Americans have less than 3 friends. 67% of Americans say they're not engaged at in work. 22% say their job's completely meaningless. And what blows people's mind is 90% of Americans still commute. And so people's day to day is like they sit in traffic, they go to a job, they look at a screen, they come home, look at a smaller screen.
Or if not a screen, maybe they're there in a food service job or a security job or something where you necessarily have to commute. Yeah, I've called it the immiseration of the country, where just people are miserable.
Yeah.
And our system is stretching us out in different ways. The simplest way to think of it is, look, let's say we had relatively stagnant incomes for a generation or so, 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then the cost of healthcare went up, the cost of education went up, the cost of housing went up. And so even from those things alone, people would be pretty sad, because you'd be like, hey, I've been running in place and my kids are going to be worse off.
Mm-hmm.
One of the stats that I found very compelling is that if you're a non-college educated American, the odds of you getting married are now less than 50%.
Mm-hmm.
It's like 46%. And as someone, and I'm married and have 2 kids, you're single as far as I know. But I'm going to suggest that a society where people don't regard marriage as something that's going to happen to them is probably not heading in a positive direction.
No, it's not great.
Yeah. I mean, there are people who have alternative arrangements and the rest of it. And like, I'm very open-minded, but big picture, like, people giving up on starting families with a committed partner in that sense. And I know there are people that are committed without being married, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But that there are all of these very disastrous trends and numbers. And I've been another huge number that is driving me to distraction nowadays, which is what the Good Life movement is trying to address, is that 70-80% of us can be for something and nothing happens. Like the relationship between public approval or public sentiment and policy is at this point next to non-existent.
It really is.
Let's change it, man. How are we going to change it?
Well, I mean, as far as solving the electoral system, that's
my job.
seemingly up to the Forward Party.
Yeah.
But once you do that, we'll solve all the mental health problems. So this was like one of the things that I thought about with the Good Life movement is, I was looking around, I was like, so we have this big crisis now, COVID has hit, we're talking about a lot, like why are we not actually making progress on mental health? Like, why is this not like a main topic in politics? Why does it not have this equal presence?
There should be a giant freaking interest group movement behind it, where if you're a legislator and you're for mental health, then you win. And if you're not on board with various common sense measures, then you lose.
Yeah. I mean, that is basically what we are coming out for. So The main approach of the Good Life movement is that we are doing political awareness and organizing for mental health. And so what that means is, we're trying to get the people more involved in the politics of mental health specifically. We have this big movement, like I said, lots of energy, but it hasn't translated into like the action and accountability to our politicians. And the way we're doing that is we're coming out with like a bigger vision of how we can solve the problems and a clear plan on how we can fix the crisis, the care crisis. The hope is that we can rally the people, build a big movement, and then funnel that very intentionally into like smart advocacy, given how the system is actually structured now, which has an outsized emphasis on the primaries. Funnel that very specifically into calls, letters, office visits, demonstrations, with the goal of getting those politicians just to be held accountable uh, for their votes, for their funding, how they approach mental health. And so the HQ of our team is going to create scorecards and hold every single politician accountable and say,
Wow.
hey, like, here's the plan. We have like 5 to 10% of the people in your district now. We've created a strong mental health voting block. We've rallied the people. Like, here's the voting card. Here are the policies that me and the rest of the gang of the mental health field have put together. Like, where do you stand on it?
Love it.
92% of Democrats, 92% of independents, and 94% of Republicans all say we need to be doing more on mental health. We have the voters. They're going to hold you accountable. What's the plan? Are you voting yes or no on this bill? So that is ultimately what we're trying to do.
Love it.
And yeah, rallying the people.
Yeah, you want us to transition from GNP, gross national product, to gross national well-being,
Yes.
GNW, which would be an incredible step up. And it would also highlight how poorly we're doing, where now we are 30th in the world in life expectancy, public education, clean air and clean water, things that, would probably lead you to be less unhappy, I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
suggest. So let's posit that we have this new benchmark and it shows how miserable we are. What are the evidence based measures that actually would make us happier and healthier? Like if you were running in, let's say, a Democratic primary or Republican primary, like what are we trying to get them on board with?
So obviously the big picture, like you said, is like we want to get them on board with one of the big ideas of our organization, which is gross domestic well-being. Because, like you said, so much of the problem is that we chase money. We have this false belief that money is a good enough proxy to the good life,
Yeah, it's
and
messed up.
it bears out in the facts and the numbers. That's just like not the case. Money does have an impact on happiness, but the numbers have shown that every dollar you have has a lesser impact on your happiness.
Wait, so just to put a number on that, the studies I've seen showed that your happiness goes up significantly as you make more money, up to approximately $75,000. And this data is a couple years old, so you could probably inflate that because of the current thing. So let's call it $80,000. And then the dollars after that don't tend to affect your well-being as much. Is that what you
Yes.
mean?
That is exactly it. So every dollar you have after a threshold has a lesser impact on your happiness, and
It's true, man.
it's
Someone gives me a dollar right now, I'm like, fuck you. I don't
well,
care.
they've actually found it's even logarithmic. So the amount of joy that you gain, let's say, going from $40,000 to $80,000 in income, to get the same units of joy, you now need to make 160 and then 320. So it starts to become much harder to get the joy and happiness that you need. And like you said, there is an inflection point, and it's between $75,000 and $105,000, somewhere in there. And so, the big idea is that we just need to recognize that, like as a society, that chasing GDP into no man's land is like so much a part of the sickness. We need to make this transition. There's a professor that said something just unbelievably powerful to me. He said, one of the major problems with how we talk about the mental health crisis and just like the sickness in general is that we are individualizing societal problems, because so much of it goes to this, like the incentive structures. And so many people, they say like, hey, we need to fix lifestyles. We need to improve the social determinants. We need to do these things because that's how we solve mental health. But it's like, hey, how are we going to do that? Like, until you fix the incentives and get all of society to smoothly roll towards like the actual goal,
Or at
the
least agree
obvious
on a
goal.
fucking baseline. That's
Yeah,
the
it's like
thing.
until you actually like set your clear goal,
Yeah.
every single just a park, you're fist fighting with like city council and legislators, because it's like it's not entirely lined up. And if you actually create a clear measure, then there's like much more effective ways on how you can quantify what's actually going to bring us well-being. So you would ask this question, like, what are the
It
things?
sounds like giving everyone money would help
Yeah, well,
if they make less than
for many
75.
people, especially because the median income, right, still rests in the 30,000s.
Yeah.
So that's like one of the big things about like gross domestic well-being is it's like it bakes in and accounts for the fact that money does have an impact on our well-being and happiness. We don't need to demonize it, but we also need to recognize there's more than that. And a good well-being measure accounts for that. And what's incredible is the field has found about 10 variables that contribute to our well-being, and that can be baked into the measure.
Do you have those
I
10?
have them memorized. You won't believe
So
how
much fun. Everyone listen up.
you won't believe.
These are the 10 things that determine our societal well-being. Lay them on us.
Now, okay, I'll lay them out, but there's different measures and you can sort of
Sure.
structure it how you want. But number one is vitality, which is like a subjective sense of vitality. I think the definitions are important with these. One is environmental mastery, a sense of being able to control your environment, positive relationships, sense of self-acceptance, a sense of mastery in your work, in your craft, in your trade, a sense of autonomy, which is basically like freedom. And I always love that one because it's like, we got one right. Like America, we nailed the freedom bucket. And then a growth mindset, your perspective on the world, engagement in your day-to-day work, so being absorbed in just like your life, and then purpose, and then transcendence, which is basically like spirituality and faith and a sense of awe and flow. And the key about these is that they're very subjective and relative to the person, which I think is super, super powerful. Rather than going around and looking at like material world outcomes and saying like we want people in houses, we want people fed and things like that.
So you're saying that gross national well-being would be determined by surveys where we measured these 10 self-reported qualities?
It very well could be.
You
I
know,
mean, there's a lot of ways that you can structure it.
yes.
And like for us, the thing is, what we're really advocating for is just moving away from this obsession with like a disproven idea that money and GDP are the way,
Yeah,
and
that's the big
transition
move.
to this new
Agreed.
idea. And we can still figure out the details of what
Yeah.
we want. There's many metrics. I mean, I could sit here and list off like 10 different
Yeah, because
ways to structure the
there are some
measure.
international standards around uh, happiness. Some of it is self-reported. They almost always use a survey, but then they can take some other empirical data
Mhm.
like suicide. Right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
like that's flaring up. Then there are problems. Life expectancy, anxiety and depression, rates of use of prescription meds. In my opinion, we're very much over medicated in this country. You know why? Because someone figured out they could make money. I mean, if it was the reverse, then all of a sudden you'd see a
Yeah.
lot, like a very, very different.
I mean, it really does go back to the incentives. And what, like you said, like there's many ways you can structure it. And what I like about it is that you can make it malleable to the community, because so many of these well-being measures, they are like effectively self-reported. Like, how do you find mastery and purpose and meaning? And so it can be relative to each, uh, local constituencies, values and expression. Like what well-being looks like in Texas is going to be a little different than California. And if you set that as the goal, how you get to purpose or meaning and bring that out in your communities is going to be different depending on the communities. So it's, as far as the specific ideas, you can run calculations, but it's going to be a little different for each community. But the obvious
Interesting.
things, right? It's where you'll have green space, walkable cities, like you'll probably see more remote work, paid family leave, investments into keeping families together, subsidizing, family therapy. The thing about this idea is unpacking a little bit of the background of it is that gross domestic well-being is produced by a currently thriving field of economists. Like this isn't just some like radical nothing
Yeah,
burger.
that people have been working on it.
I mean,
there
there's
are countries that have adopted.
Yeah, it's like the United Kingdom has gross domestic well-being. It was introduced by conservative Prime Minister David Cameron. And then when they actually instituted it, when they were like working the numbers and trying to figure out how to make it go up, they created this revolutionary program to increase access to a super effective form of therapy for $1,000 a patient. They had 51% rates of full recovery from depression across
Wow.
the UK. And this wasn't like a micro study. They serviced like 10% of the population in the UK.
Wow.
I mean, it was like a huge sample size.
I've got a feeling that 10% or more of the U.S. could benefit from some therapy personally. So you just rattled off a whole set of things that it sounds like would help make us happier and healthier. and all of those make sense. I'll say that for me, some of the things that come to mind. Well, for myself, if I'm feeling down, one of the things I try and do is exercise. Ideally outdoors, because that's a double whammy.
Hmm.
And studies have shown, because I'm into data, studies have shown that exposure to nature is actually uplifting and good for your mental health, and exercise is good for your mental health.
Yeah.
So guess what? Exercising outdoors is probably good for your mental health. Instead of people paying to join a gym, it's like we should either we should be paying you to go to the gym, or
Seriously.
certainly for me, one of the things you mentioned, I'm really passionate about, is trying to find healthy outlets for men, in particular young men who are lost. And if you leave
Yeah.
young men to their own devices, they can go down some very, very negative
Very distract or
roads,
destructive.
self-destructive or externally destructive. And one of the things that I've found to be very, very good for getting out certain impulses or aggression is martial arts training, particularly jujitsu, but any martial arts training. It gives you a sense of camaraderie and fellowship and
Dude,
the rest of it. And
I
so
love
I was
jujitsu.
talking about having like essentially like a national MMA freaking program. And in my mind's eye too, that this is how crazy I got in my mind's eye, was that you'd have champions of every town and county and weight class and state, and then you'd have people competing, and then there'd be like this sort of national dragnet of badassery. But I dare say this would be about 1,000 times more healthy than whatever the fuck is going on now. So this is one of my
Oh
dreams. Did I
gosh.
talk that much about that particular dream? No, I did not. But was it a dream? Yes, it was. So like, what are the things that because I know you've dug very deep into the research. Like, what are the things that would actually make people happier and healthier?
Just as an aside, I do jujitsu and I highly endorse it. It's very cathartic and all of those things. You get a great community. I mean, one of the things that they've definitely found in the science is like, well, you can find happiness in like any type of lifestyle. Like vitality is literally defined as like a subjective sense. Tom Insel, the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, he says in his book that mental health outcomes are determined 10 to 15% by healthcare. The rest of it is our lifestyles. And so much of our approach has to be this whole person thinking, like you said, like it literally includes like our diet and our meaning and our community and our social life and family and transportation and housing and all these things. And again, which is why we're sort of for gross domestic well-being, is because if you fight each of those battles individually until the incentives are not aligned, you're just like fist fighting into no man's land. As far as the specifics, so the highest correlate to like depression and often unfortunately suicide is a lack of meaning. And the numbers have shown that the greatest driver of meaning is just a sense of belonging. So the number one thing, that we could probably do is find ways to increase meaning and community.
The search for meaning is the big one, and the simplest way to substitute something in for meaning is community, in my mind, because then you can be working alongside other people and accomplish something that you're excited about and proud of.
I will share one of the things that we are working on is putting out what we're basically going to call as like a cultural vision, which is so much of what we're discussing, right, are things the government can't really be involved in, nor should it be, like creating meaning in people's lives. It's kind of a strange role for the government. But we have to acknowledge that this is like the root of the sickness and the problem is it's our lifestyles. And so we're looking to basically create a massive working group that includes both, researchers and all sorts of random people who know the answers to things, but also the people, and create this sort of like open working group on like, hey, what is the cultural vision here? Where it's like we can set a clear intent. Because again, if you have like the tip of the spear is the gross domestic well-being, which is like this is what the government can do, but that is what is super powerful is if your government just actually comes out and says, hey, like our own well-being is like
The point.
the increase, it's our priority. The fact that we have to like fight for that is strange. But then from there is the trickle down where people say, oh wow, like now is the time, here's the like now is the people's century or whatever, and what is the cultural vision that we want. And so we're working on putting that together because so much of it, like you said, it's these communities and tribes and clubs and things like that. And it's like, how do we do that? I Like it's complex, but so much value is gained in like having a clear goal and a clear place to go. So, for the people who are interested in like assembling the cultural vision, like come by, goodlifemovement.org.
So, what are the solutions that the research indicates would actually help us, help our
Yeah.
well-being?
So when it comes to the care system, there are probably, there's so much that we can do, but the three main buckets are the 988 number, but not just the number, but building out the entire care
You mean
system.
like a 911 for mental health?
Yes. So it just recently transitioned 2 months ago. We had only basically the 911 number. Now we have a 988 number for mental health crises, substance use, even. And so that is basically just a number right now. And the effective solution is building out a care continuum. And the best part about this is if we build out
How
the
many communities
continuum,
have a 988 number now?
technically everyone, but there's regional call centers all around the country. And if one region doesn't have the capacity, it just gets wired to another state. But again, the 988 number right now is primarily peer specialists with some training. But that's all it really is. Your optimal solution is that you actually build out, carry on like mobile crisis teams where you have like a psychiatric nurse, peer specialist, and clinical social worker. And those are obviously fantastic models where right now, if someone is in crisis and the person on the number can't help them solve it, rather than calling the police who has no training in it and nowhere to take them, they call a 988 number. The 24/7 mobile van shows up and they help talk them down. The social worker speaking with the family. It's a much better picture. It also obviously saves money. They've rolled this out in Maricopa County, Arizona, and they've been able to shift 37 police officers off of mental health duty onto like solving crimes while also saving hospitals $37 million. And if someone is in a terrible crisis and the mobile crisis team can't solve it, we need to build out what are called like behavioral health urgent care clinics. So it's very similar to like what we have in New York City, City MD, where something urgently comes up, there's no wait, you can go and get access. And we don't really have these in the mental health care system much at all. They do exist, but it's very spotty. We have one of the leading models are called CCBHCs, which doesn't, that's a whole jargon. But the point is, we have about 400 of them, which is very limiting. And those are tremendous centers that have integrated, coordinated care, where you have psychologists and therapists, and all the medications for substance use overdose. And so if someone goes in there, there's someone who can talk them down, who can give medicine. There's even sometimes physicians who can have a medical overhead approach. And that is like the vision for the care system overall, rather than like stumbling through this care system. This is something people don't realize, is that mental health care treatments are actually super, super effective. Part of the problem right now is that they're not delivered in the way that they should be delivered. 85% of psychiatric drugs are prescribed by people without psychiatric backgrounds. And that's not a knock on like the primary care physicians and nurses doing that. The problem is that people don't have access to the actual psychiatrists and physicians. And so they have to get care where they can, but good care is very intentionally timed. You're focusing on like this drug, this timing, then you bring in this type of talk therapy with this type of therapist, you have the overhead of the physician. Like that is the vision of like what care can be. And so we need to build out not just the care continuum, but then have that sort of like integration that comes with that. The second thing, big solution, is obviously taking on the insurance companies to increase access and reduce costs. Just the cold truth is that many insurance companies are just like blatantly discriminating against mental health. So if you're a psychiatrist or a therapist or whatever, they reimburse you at much lower rates. And so basically these people can't run their business. If they take your insurance, like they literally can't, pay their staff. What ends up happening is that they only take out of
Patients.
pocket patients, which consolidates them into basically like affluent neighborhoods. And so you have these radical disparities in access, where it's right now 55% of the counties in the United States don't have a single mental health psychiatrist, psychologist, or social worker. 73% of counties don't have a child psychiatrist at all. I mean, at all. I mean, we have this youth crisis. I mean, the numbers are so bad that an 18-year-old can get a gun faster than they can get an appointment with a psychiatrist. And so much of that problem is, again, the disparities in like insurance. And the thing is, this is super illegal. In 2008, Patrick Kennedy, I swear that family has been like on the mental health game. Patrick Kennedy passes this legislation among other legislators in DC that made it completely illegal, and insurance companies must cover mental health equally to physical health. And yet they're just like not listening. They just don't really follow the law. And so I actually have connected with a top official here in New York State who is working on holding Medicaid insurance companies accountable for basically like stealing money from people who are trying to make claims for their mental health care. And in the last few years, just New York State alone, just Medicaid, he found them stealing over $230 million. And they're using that money to buy the votes to prevent the accountability to hold them accountable. I mean,
You can
it's just
easily see
ridiculous.
insurance companies denying these claims because they fall into something of the gray area where it's like,
Yeah.
in their minds. I mean, what you're saying is, look, mental health is health, and I think everyone can agree with that.
Yeah. Mental health is definitely health. And so, we basically just need to enforce the laws that we have, and we can solve that problem. And then the third thing that we really need to focus on is just obviously our youth. Youth outcomes, as mentioned, are tremendously bad coming through COVID. 44% of our youth feel a persistent feeling of hopelessness and sadness. Suicide rates are up 84% in the last 10 years, with an outsized emphasis on young Black men, LGBTQ, and trans. I mean, they've 3x the rates of attempted suicides.
Latino girls had a surge in particular that I found out about. It was like that's terrible. They're also really strikingly bad statistics for boys in general.
Yes. I mean, it's again like this very much is the everyone cause. I mean, when you look at the numbers, it's sometimes a little different in like what exactly like what's the exact poison, but everyone is struggling, and we have the answers to a care system. With youth, it's like there's so many obvious solutions. Like one of the major things that the whole mental health field is supporting is just teaching life skills in school.
Yeah.
One of the most invigorating things is that the mental health field has like many of the answers. And when I first began this journey into this organization, before I even committed to it, I spent months and months determining if we actually had the answers, and we totally have it. Between the 988 number, building out the care system, taking on the insurance companies to reduce costs, increase access, and then securing our youth and improving our school system and strengthening the family system with a larger cultural vision, right? The gross domestic well-being and this trickle down of the incentives. Like this is actually how we can begin to shift the direction of the crisis into actually moving us not just out of crisis, but towards like a more abundant, like flourishing society. And it's like not something that'll obviously happen overnight. It's not a panacea, but this is all obtainable. It's like not far out. I mean, this is a bipartisan cause that everyone loves, that people are ready to go to war for it.
Don't you mean tripartisan? I'm kidding. Yeah, it's interesting when you say it's like, hey, you got to be pro mental health. The first thing someone might think is, okay, we need to invest in psychologists, psychiatrists, beds,
Yeah.
therapeutic environments. But you're thinking much bigger than that.
Yeah. Well, it's like when I thought I was going to be the outlier, but I have spent, for context, I soft launched this organization roughly 6 or 7 months ago, and I had written a white paper, and I took the message around the mental health field to like shop around the ideas, and I was met with like resounding excitement, not just in the idea of creating a clear organization for the people to rally together and fight for mental health, but actually in this broader vision. The ex director of the National Institute of Mental Health of 12 years wrote a book where he basically says like to really
We need
solve
a
the
political
problem, we
movement
need to
on this.
think like whole person population health. I mean, I recently spoke with the CEO of the American Psychological Association, Dr. Arthur Evans, and he said the number one thing or contribution that your organization could make to this field is bring this bigger vision to the people of population health, because so much of how we're
Wow.
solving the problems right now is that we're focusing on like the care system. It's like trying to solve a whole crisis by only building hospitals.
Well, if you make the point of the economy our well-being, then everything ends up being an investment if it improves your
Yeah.
well-being. And right now, if you see it as a cost, then it's then it ends up reversing things. I think about the Good Life movement as the march for our lives of mental health. Is that a fair
It
comparison?
is fairly accurate. I don't know the details of what they do. It is fairly accurate. We're going to do much more education around the topic. Like I said, we have to bring this message of a larger
And
approach.
it affects
Um,
everyone uh, from people in rural communities who are struggling. When I was in Iowa, they were talking about farmer suicide shooting up, to people who are struggling with uh, belonging in, uh, like any community really,
yes.
for any reason. So I love the universality of it. I hope it does become a thriving political movement that ends up pushing us in the right direction. And I would love for a Forward Party to be supportive and part of it. You know what? I'm actually going to make this commitment right here. We're going to put pressure on the Democrats and Republicans by saying the Forward Party is with the Good Life movement. So now you've got one of three, and then the other two now will have to be like, oh snap! Like if we want to get the 92% of the voters out there who want this, like we have to get on board too.
It would be tremendous. It really is the everyone cause. Um, I mean, it affects uh, everyone in different ways, but like you said, from farmers to veterans to mothers,
To trans youth.
immigrants to trans youth to LGBTQ to, you
Yeah,
know,
among military
like
veterans, people coming out of foster care, like you see among certain groups, the adverse outcomes are much they're shockingly prevalent.
yeah.
It's something that makes you super sad.
I mean, something I want to unpack a little bit of the background of our mental health care system because I think this will rightly piss off a lot of people and get them
It's probably money involved. Continue.
pretty ready to fight. So, I mean, obviously, mental health has always been sort of just like discriminated against since like the beginning of time. I mean, until even in the early 1900s, 33 states, sterilization was legal for people with mental disabilities and mental health issues, which is like heinous. In the early 1900s, everyone with serious mental illness was mostly being basically just like warehoused in asylums. Like
It's
that
like
wasn't
a
the
one
original.
flew over the cuckoo's nest type stuff.
Yeah, that wasn't the original vision of those state hospitals, but that is like what they became because the political will wasn't there. It really began the story begins in the 1950s and 1960s. JFK was looking at that system and he was like, "This is like shitty, and we need to change it." And the original shift was to move to community mental health centers, which are like sort of wholesome idea of like 16 beds, 2-to-1 staff to patient ratio, where you can incorporate this like community lifestyle improvement. There's a huge focus on routines. Mom and dad can come by and hang out. And he actually passes this landmark legislation in 1963 that was set to close the asylums and move everyone into and build out this huge network of this like fantastic care system. And he gets assassinated 3 weeks later. And so the movement loses its political head and leadership. What ends up happening is the funding doesn't really continue, and yet the bill was passed. So the asylums are closed, and the mental health centers are never built.
Wow.
And so we go from 95% or 95% of our public beds are still to this day gone. We went from 337 beds per 100,000 residents to 12
Ugh.
for public beds. And if you're wondering, like, where did those people go? It manifested into two of the crises that we talk about most today, which is mass incarceration and the homelessness crisis, where the numbers are people who are homeless or unhoused have 20 to 25% rates of serious mental illness, which is 500% times the rate of the general population. And then in your jail system, the jail system is ridiculous as far as like how it relates to mental health. Similarly, 20 to 25% are the rates, and we have 10 times the amount of people with serious mental illness in our jail system versus our state hospital system.
Wow.
In 44 states, there's more people in the jails than the state hospital system. And Los Angeles County Jail is the nation's largest mental health provider,
Uh,
and this is all to the tune of $33,000 per inmate
per year.
per year, and 21. This is the stat that just rocked my world. 21% of all police time is spent answering calls regarding serious mental illness.
Sure.
21% of all time. I mean, that's like billions, maybe tens of billions of dollars. And so, if you're wondering, like, why didn't we fix it since then? Jimmy Carter actually tried to solve the problem. In the 70s, he makes this big campaign, creates a consortium. In 1980, he actually passes the legislation with Ted Kennedy. Reagan gets elected, and he's like, no, it's a moral failing. People are weak. Drugs
Ugh.
are bad. Repeals the whole thing. Again, cuts off the head of the mental health field, and he literally banishes the mental health and psychological team that was a permanent fixture in Carter's White House in the West Wing. He banishes them. And so you ran for president saying like we need a psychologist in the White House. We actually used to have that. We used to have that, and then Reagan banished them. And not only did that kill the momentum of the field, it actually reinvigorated the stigma and it stalled the field. And so we've basically had like no major developments, at least at the federal level, for 40 years. And so we have like 40 years of innovations. We had the answers 40 years ago, and we still haven't even been able to implement that. What we had 40 years ago, nonetheless, the innovation and the new ideas since. And so we have, I feel bad for the people in the mental health field. They've been like fighting like hell, underfunded, undersupported, with the answers like, hey, please, can we fund this stuff? We know what we need to do. We'll solve the care crisis. And nobody's been listening. But now
the Good Life movement
moment.
is here to change it. So I dream about a positive, unifying political movement that will result in people's lives being better. And you are building just that, my friend. I'm so proud of you and happy. I was going to say happy for you. I mean, you have a lot of work ahead, but like happy to support you in any way that we can so that you actually get some of these things implemented in real life. Because even having gross national well-being, that would be a major step. But if we can start providing the resources and the answers to some of these problems that we can all see getting worse around us, like that is truly the way out. If someone wants to help drive the movement and help it succeed, where should they go?
Well, they should go to goodlifemovement.org and donate $1, because right now the entire establishment, the media, celebrities, influencers, advocates, like I've talked to all of these people, and they're all looking for the thing that they can bet on to help lead the people to beat this crisis, implement these solutions, and enhance our lifestyles. And this is the organization. Nobody else is doing this. Like, this is the reason I am building the Good Life movement. Is I looked around in 2021 and I was like, why is no one doing this? This is the super obvious movement
mental health
that we need.
Super obvious.
So if people donate $1, it's basically an endorsement of the ideas and visions. And then, we're small and volunteer driven right now, but if we have 5 or 10,000 just $1 donors through the winter and into the early spring, suddenly all of the media and all of the establishment, they look around and like, oh, like, how the hell did they do that? That's a lot of people. This is the thing that I just wake up to excited every day, where it's like, this is so obvious. Like, we have the people, we have the plan, we have like the willpower. Like, what are we doing? All we need
to
doing? Bring the people down.
Indeed, Andrew. $1 for mental health, I think, is a very, very reasonable ask. And I guarantee that if someone donates $1, they'll get more than $1 back just out of the satisfaction of knowing that they're part of something so positive. I can't wait to work with you on this and to see you build this movement into something that improves the lives of millions of people here in America and around the world.
Well,
Good Life movement, man. Who could be against that? Not this guy who's for that. I'm going to donate my $1 right now. Congratulations, Andrew Frawley. I'll even donate more than $1. Let's go, Good Life movement. Let's build it.
Yay. Thank you.